Ladies and gentlemen, as we move into our next panel, one of the highlights of the last discussion that was brought up was that no matter what, the President and Congress are going to have a deep agenda on national security, defense, intelligence policy making as we look forward to the next Congress. And one of the items that we hope will shape that debate are the recommendations of the National Defense Panel, on which both Ambassador Eric Edelman, who's also a member of FPI's Board of Directors, and former Congressman Jim Marshall served before issuing their July 2014 report. It's a pleasure to welcome Vago Muradian, who will be moderating this conversation. Vago is the editor of Defense News, and especially want to highlight Sunday mornings on ABC at 11 a.m. Is the host of Inside Defense News. This week.
No, we dropped it this week.
It's no longer this week.
Well, yeah, because when we shifted from CBS to ABC, you can't have this week and this week. So instead of Stephanopoulos complaining about why we shamelessly plagiarized them, we changed it to Defense News. So it's Defense News with Vago Muradian.
Even concision, even better. Defense News with Vago Muradian, 11 a.m. on ABC. But thank you so much, Vago, and thank you so much, Ambassador and Congressman, for joining us.
Thanks very much, Chris. I appreciate it. Chris was one of our first guests, so I owe Chris a lot. Thank you very much. You're doing a great job with the organization. I'm honored to be here. I'm particularly honored to be on a panel with both Ambassador Edelman and Congressman Marshall, because common defense is one of those fundamental things that the government is supposed to provide for under the Constitution, unsurprisingly. And it can be argued that it's having an exceptionally difficult time doing that at a very, very complicated time in national security. The defense game is fundamentally changing. Technology is leveling. Can improve our capabilities, but also advantage a lot of our adversaries, including a lot of non-state actors. As you saw, Richard Hartigan, the head of GCHQ, Britain's version of the NSA, sort of said that Twitter and Facebook are being used by ISIS as not only command and control, but recruitment and propaganda tools. So that is a different universe in which you're living, and that's one of the reasons why Secretary Work and Secretary Hagel, Deputy Secretary Work, and Secretary Hagel are working on the offset strategy, obviously. But the fundamental reality of national security decision-making is the necessity to make choices. America's always faced crises. There have always been throughout history. If you go and you look at the SecDef histories, you see how many SecDefs have dealt with, sort of a cavalcade of problems while also struggling with resources. And in this effort to try to make better choices, we sort of adopted it with the Cold War, the Quadrennial Defense Review, as a way to sort of help us do this, the bottom-up review, which spawned the Quadrennial Defense Review. And no sooner did we have a Quadrennial Defense Review, as somebody who's covered all of them, there were criticisms that it wasn't good enough, and so Bill Cohen convened a National Defense Panel in 1997 to review the QDR, and then it was about a dozen years later that it was mandated that there be an official relook at American strategy independently on a regular basis, and hence the National Defense Panel, appointed both by Congress and the administration to try to achieve this goal of an actual bipartisan independent review of U.S. strategy. The most recent NDP issued its report in July, of which fortunately our panelists have copies here. I have a printed out copy in my bag, and several months after the Pentagon put out its QDR, and some of the fundamentals of it was to end budget cuts and return to sort of normal financial order, and as Secretary Gates, under the FY 2012 budgets that Secretary Gates had originally proposed, retain a force sizing construct that Ambassador Edelman describes as the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time, which I think is an important thing for us to be able to do. Immediately reverse readiness cuts that are gravely damaging warfighting capabilities, especially once you get through all the tricks that have been used so far to actually try to minimize those impacts, and that the 2014 QDR force sizes were too small. I'm not going to get into, everybody I think already has our biographies here of our distinguished panelists. But what I wanted to do is just start off the discussion, and we're going to have sort of a half-an-hour discussion, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions. But Ambassador Edelman, you and Michelle Flournoy yesterday testified before the House Armed Services Committee. You were both NDP members. What are the biggest problems that you guys saw and see continued with the QDR?
I think our concern as a panel with the QDR, and this year's panel, under the legislation and the NDAA that chartered us, was able to begin its work. I was on the panel 4 years ago, by the way, as well. 4 years ago, we got the QDR considered as a panel, issued our report. This time around, the Congress actually chartered us to begin our work in parallel with the development of the QDR. So we actually convened in the summer of 2013 as a panel and began our work then. We were briefed during the process of the QDR. We went through the terms of reference, met with Secretary Hagel at the outset, met with him again when the QDR was about to be released. So we did that in part because I think the Congress wanted us to be able, should we have chosen to do it, to play a role having some input into the QDR. And I think our decision as a panel was not to try and formally provide input because it seemed a little awkward to us to then be criticizing something that we had had a hand in drafting, but rather I think through our Socratic process of asking questions of the briefers may have had some influence on the QDR. That being said, I think all of us had the same reaction, I believe, which was that under the budget circumstances of the time, which was with sequester being implemented, the possibility that it was going to be implemented again in 2014 before the deal that halted sequester, that the uncertainties that the department faced were so great, not knowing what their top line was going to be, whether it was going to be the BCA number with sequester, whether it was going to be the president's budget or something in between, that it was impossible for them to do a document that would be, as Secretary Panetta said at the Reagan Defense Forum 2 weeks ago, a strategy-driven budget rather than a budget-driven strategy. So I think our sense was that the folks in DOD were working very hard to try and do the right thing for the nation, but that the constraints they operated under made it impossible to produce a strategic document that could be considered on those terms. So I think what we decided to do as a panel, and Jim will correct me if I've got it wrong, is basically put the QDR to one side. It's not that we weren't informed by it, but we didn't think that the Congress would be well served or the public by spending a lot of time kind of grading the Pentagon's homework, but rather tried to set out what we thought were the major issues confronting the nation with regard to defense. And really it boils down to, I think, a question of whether or not the United States is going to continue to play the role we've played since 1945 of providing global public goods and a framework for international order and a rules-based international system.
The backbone for the world's security architecture, effectively.
Exactly, and that essentially we're at a cusp here, we're at a turning point, an inflection point, if you will. If we don't get rid of sequester and the BCA caps on the defense budget, it seemed clear to us as a panel that the United States will not be able in the future to continue to play that role. That's why we, as a panel, I think, suggested, as you noted, Vago, that we get rid of the BCA caps, that sequester be repealed, that we return to the FY12 proposed Gates defense budget, which was the last defense budget that was based on any kind of serious analysis of the threats and problems facing the nation, that we embrace some of the reforms that have been suggested, and some other things that I'm sure Congressman Marshall will want to talk about as well.
Sir?
Well, I agree with everything that Eric just said, and would add that the reason we picked the Gates FY12 proposed budget was in part because Secretary Gates quite clearly was very cost containment conscious. He had already directed massive cuts to the budget for the Defense Department, so we thought that the Gates budget would have a lot of credibility. It was the last time that the department was free to plan based on strategy as opposed to planning based on budget availability. And we thought that, you could hardly argue that that budget was too generous because Gates was very aggressive about cost cutting within the department. So we picked that as the top line that realistically we ought to have as a minimum. I would add to that top line what we need in order to deal with modernization of our strategic forces. And I think we all agreed that needed to be done as well. There have been estimates that that's going to cost as much as $35 billion a year over a 30-year period of time. Others say, no, it won't cost nearly that much. But if it does cost $35 billion a year over a 30-year period of time, and we cannot afford that as a nation, we've got huge problems. I mean, that's no money, given the size of our economy and both the economic and security interests that are at stake when you think about modernizing that. So I would say Gates, top line, plus what's required to modernize our strategic forces. So that's one observation. It's, we thought that in addition to the QDR being more budget-driven than strategy-driven, that the QDR selected the wrong force sizing construct. Since the bottom-up review, the force sizing construct had been this: we're going to fight two major wars on two fronts. We need to be prepared to do that. We don't want to do that, but we need to be prepared to do that, so we need to size the force in order to have that capability. A number of us observed that that's a nice objective, but we've never been able to size the force to have that capability in the way that we had in mind, and which is basically we're going to fight major wars that lead to regime change, occupation, that sort of thing. And we thought, given the way the globe is right now, and as we think the globe's going to evolve, a better force sizing construct would be to be able to fight one major war that doesn't necessarily, hopefully doesn't lead to occupation, regime change, et cetera, but it's a major war. At the same time that we're in a position to deter aggressive behavior in a number of different areas across, so what you see in the world today as you look at different pockets across the globe is different countries that are developing significant strategic military capabilities and that are interested in actually being pretty aggressive. And they're discouraged from being pretty aggressive in part because of the alliances and the assurances that the United States has given to a whole host of allies across the globe. If the United States is bogged down in one major conflict, you could see opportunists and opportunistic behavior around the globe by people who would like to be aggressive with their neighbors. And as a result, we thought that a more realistic force sizing construct would be one in which we could, as a matter of fact, I won't name names here, but somebody came up with the idea is beat the hell out of. So if somebody's going to act inappropriately aggressive, we need to have the capability of beating the hell out of them so that they know that they shouldn't act like that. And if they're going to act like that, we're going to deal with the situation we've got here. And once we've finished with this situation, we're going to come deal with you. But in the meantime, if you're going to act like that, we're really going to punish you. Is the force sizing construct that we thought was more appropriate.
But isn't that roughly what the administration concluded, which was, fight one, hold another one off, while being able to do a couple of other smaller things? I mean, aren't we? We
think it's hold more than one.
Win, hold, win, which was.
And we thought that force sizing construct's more realistic given the world environment that we're in right now.
I think part of the difference, Vago, is that what we were talking about is the ability to do one high-end conflict with a kind of near-peer competitor, which would be quite intense and have heavy draw on the force, while at the same time retaining capability to deal with, as Congressman Marshall was just saying, multiple potential opportunistic aggressors in overlapping timeframes. Right. And I think that made it a little bit more stressful, would make it more stressful on the force than the force sizing construct that was actually in the QDR. And one of the things we suggested in the panel report was that the department actually go back and look at what it would take to actually execute this more stressful force planning construct, because it I think gets to the question of what should the size of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, Air Force, et cetera, be.
We also referred to the Budget Control Act and Sequestration Agreement that was entered into in 2011 as self-defeating. A huge strategic misstep on the part of the United States. And of course, in defense of those who entered into that agreement, it was they expected that that they would never have permitted that to continue because they recognized that this was really a big problem if in fact it continued. And so they thought that this would be a forcing mechanism to get them to come to the table and deal with other issues. And they just haven't been able to do that. So it wasn't that they were ignorant at the time that this was a big deal. But with hindsight, not only just a big deal, it's a serious strategic error by the United States.
Well, I mean, we did that right because we got to the debt precipice. We wanted to avoid a default for the first time in our history. It was the Damoclean sword to prevent, right? And neither caucus went for it, right? On the Republican side, it was reduce government spending. On the Democrat side, it was try to avoid entitlement reform. So we've had months of pressing this case, years of pressing this case. You were just up on the Hill. Do you see any motion for members to come to the table and actually resolve this?
So one way of putting it, rather than use the sort of Damocles analogy, which a lot of people have used, my colleague Todd Harrison, who you know well at CSBA, has basically said that the problem here is that both the executive and legislative branches have taken the defense budget hostage with slightly different theories of the case.
Yes.
The executive branch case was if we hold the defense budget hostage, we will get Republicans to agree to raise taxes. And in the legislative branch, the theory was if we hold the defense budget hostage, we could get the president to reduce discretionary domestic spending. Both propositions over the last 3 years have been definitively exposed as wrong. But when two sides are at an impasse and have taken the same hostage, it doesn't usually work out well for the hostage.
And they don't care about the well-being of the hostage, right? So, so ultimately then, what's the resolution here? You were, you sat in there, you were a member of Congress. Is there a political solution here?
Well, I think Congress and the President will sort of muddle along and come up with an appropriate solution because I think there's a growing recognition that this is pretty disastrous from the perspective of the United States. And it's not just security-wise. It's also economically, and few people understand that. The world economically is so intertwined, and we've largely midwifed that. We've been very responsible for the not only architecture of security that you see globally, but an awful lot of the economic progress that's been made globally. And as a result, the United States economy is inextricably intertwined with the global economy. And you hear these voices. We've always had folks who are isolationist. And we weren't exactly isolationist, but as a country we were sort of that way for most of our history. And then we made a sharp right turn after World War II, facing the threat of communism, nuclear war, after 2 global wars in the first half of the 20th century. We made a decision that we were going to aggressively attempt to shape the world. And the result of that is the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, all kinds of pacts and treaties that we have globally that create this architecture that is one that guarantees some modicum of stability. And then also all these agreements globally that enhance global trade. To the extent that, and there have been lots of econometric studies that back this up. And they're more modern because the information's the ability to crank it out with computers and to have information that's reasonably accurate has only been available to us in the last sort of 40 or 50 years. But lots of recent studies show that as instability rises, global wealth decreases. Global wealth decreases. In the United States, our wealth decreases, which means tax returns decrease, and they decrease more than what you've saved as a result of cutting the defense budget. So it's, as we described it, self-defeating, we think, for 2 reasons. One, it increases the likelihood that we will experience defeats on the battlefields, read lives, limbs lost unnecessarily. And it also increases the likelihood that we'll be poorer and less able to meet other federal priorities.
But how do you respond to the criticism made even by people within the department that if you just look at the Fourth Estate alone, you look at the number of civilian billet gains since 9/11,
Right.
those increased, military billets increased, military billets are expected to be reduced, and yet the civil understructure of the department, it's contractor based. I mean, I know that Secretary Gates sort of declared war, if you will, on contractors to a degree, but you know, there's still this enormous overhead structure that goes with the department, and there are those who say that that is actually what's sapping the lifeblood out of the department for each dollar that goes into it. So isn't it equally important and people like Gordon Adams and others argue that, you know, look, the only way you're going to force the reform of that organization is to actually cut its funding, and then that is what will actually drive, at the end of the day, the reforms that I think are absolutely necessary. What do you think?
Well, I think that proposition has already been tested and is proven wrong. I mean, we've had 6 years of $1 trillion plus cuts. I don't see any evidence that the Fourth Estate has shrunk very much, if at all. And we agree, by the way, in our report that the Fourth Estate needs to be cut. One of the things we argue for is that the SecDef needs the kind of authorities that Bill Perry had, and Bill was, you know, our co-chairman and felt strongly about this. The authorities he had, for instance, to RIF civilian employees in order to, you know, be able to cut back some of the administrative overhead and bloat that you're talking about. So it's not something that we ignored in the report. On the contrary, we want to arm the department to be able to go forth and do battle with the Fourth Estate.
You know, I don't know whether in our final document we went as far as a number of us wanted to go on this particular point. But inefficiency and waste within the Defense Department becomes a strategic problem for the Defense Department, to the extent that inefficiency and waste can be cited as a reason for not increasing the top line. We know that increasing the top line is critically important to getting to where we need to be in order to have the appropriate global presence, to meet our commitments, to assure our allies, etc., to discourage potential aggressors, to maintain the stability that I was describing previously. And that's a strategic goal that's critically important, and we are at great risk of not being able to accomplish that goal if the top line isn't increased. And then you look at the inefficiencies within the department, and you worry, good gosh, if we don't clean this up, how is the American public, how are politicians going to be able to support increasing the top line? And so within the department, it's critically important that you address issues like this particular one. And Michael Baer, by the way,
Yeah.
has been on a tear about this, as you know, former head of the Defense Business Board. And his presentation is pretty compelling.
It's extraordinary. But one of the other challenges is every year the department thinks it can hold its breath, survive the wave, not have to make some of the tough choices, because there's going to be money at the other end of it. I mean, strategy is. You were going to say something.
No, you finish, and then I'll
Well,
launch off on Congress.
Please. In that case, yes. That's one of the reasons why everybody's tuned in. No, it's like a reformed smoker. You know, they're the ones who are really going to take off on it. But there's this sense that the department can always hold its breath. This wave is going to end up passing. We can then get back to normal. Republicans will get elected. They'll just give us more money. And, you know, at the end, strategy is always about balancing ends and, you know, means. And so ultimately, do we need to have a fundamentally different approach to the way that we're doing this, moving away from a QDR structure, an NDP structure, but to some other way of sort of devising sort of more lasting security architecture? Wes Clark argues for that our strategy ought to be something that lasts across administrations and is aimed at the strategic best interest of the country, and puts the political minutia of this, which is, you know, I will not allow a squadron to leave my state, because that means I've just baited that base.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. But add this: one of our hopes, we intentionally kept the National Defense Panel's report fairly short, very top line, and we put a lot of emphasis on the introduction and the interests and objectives sections, which explain why we need to be doing this. It doesn't have to be done exactly as either Eric or I or anybody else wants it done. But as a country, we need to be doing this. And one thing that we observe in the report is that it has not mattered until recently whether it's a Republican administration, a Democratic administration, a Republican-controlled House, Senate, Democratic-controlled House and Senate, we have been very consistent as a country on the policies that have led to this global architecture that's very good for everybody security-wise and economically. Very consistent. And we worry that that could ebb. We hear voices on both sides that seem to be attacking that, isolationist voices that I think are very immature and inappropriate. And so we hope that the panel's report can maybe serve as a touchstone for all the presidential candidates in the next campaign. So that it doesn't matter to us whether it's a Democratic or a Republican-controlled White House. They're headed in the direction that we suggest we need to be headed in this report. And then back to Congress, I was a member of the Armed Services Committee. When I became a member of Congress, it would have been more natural for me to be on financial services because throughout my professional career, that's what I'd done basically. And it's what I knew most of. I'd been in the military. I'd grown up in a military family, but I had been away from that for a long time. Why was I on the armed services? Well, the main economic driver in my district was Warner Robins Air Base. Great facility, do great work, support the country, but they're also critically important to the economy of that area. So I'm a representative. I'm going to represent the folks that put me in there. Why did they put me in there? Well, the main reason they put me in there was not to have some, esoteric arguments about morality or et cetera, et cetera. They wanted that base protected and grown. And so you think about how the Armed Services Committee gets populated. It gets populated by people like me. And we're trying to argue for, keeping our bases, our troops, et cetera. And it means that the Armed Services Committee, while it's excellent, it really knows its stuff, and from a sort of more global perspective can carry the message that the top line needs to be increased, et cetera. But the Armed Services Committee itself can get too much in the weeds of management and not give appropriate management discretion to the department to deal with some of the inefficiencies that are a strategic threat at this point.
Vago, let me just add two things, because really your question had, to unpack it a little bit, had a couple of different pieces. So on the reform agenda, and which is, goes beyond kind of cutting the headquarters bloat, and it encapsulates things like compensation reform, retirement, health care, et cetera. The problem of the entitlements inside the defense budget that are microcosm of the national entitlements problems, but which, because of cost growth, threaten to, at some point, eat the whole budget. And my colleague Todd Harrison at CSBA, as you know, has a chart that shows, at current growth rates, although they've gone down a little bit, at some point, 30 years from now, the whole defense budget goes to this. So we have to get a handle on that. We address that in the report, but the reality is, and I think everyone on the panel agrees with this, if you got the wildest success, and Gordon Adams, by the way, briefed us as a panel, and you were able, on more than one occasion, if you were able to get, catastrophic success and get all of this stuff done, you'd get about $150 billion over 10 years.
Over 10 years.
And that's just not enough to fill the gap that we saw, that's been created by both the initial budget cuts and now on top of that the BCA caps and sequestration. That's point one. Point two, on the question of strategy and surviving different presidential administrations. At one level, I absolutely agree with that. And in reality, I think we would argue, the panel really implicitly argues that has been the case since 1945, that we have had a national strategy and that you can see it. Sometimes it's not articulated, but you can see it at work in how successive administrations have, dealt with certain problems. So, for instance, President Carter announced the Carter Doctrine, saying that the United States would not allow an outside power to dominate the Persian Gulf. The reality is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was directed at them, But even before the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States had made it clear through its behavior across multiple administrations that it wasn't going to tolerate an internal power in the Persian Gulf dominating the Persian Gulf either. So you can see this, continuity through time. I myself am not having presided over a QDR, and it should be said that a QDR is not actually a national. It's not a grand strategy. It's actually not a national strategy. And the document itself and the way we do it, I think, is in dire need of reform. I mean, this is something that our panel didn't take on this time, although the previous panel did suggest that maybe we should think about whether the QDR has had its time and day. I mean, a process which basically allows the military departments of the Department of Defense to spend 1 year preparing for and throwing thousands of bodies at, and then produces, and I presided over one of these, so this is in the category of criticism, self-criticism, produces a document that says, you know what, the program of record looks pretty good to us, but we need to make a few tweaks here and there. And basically, if you look back at every QDR, that's pretty much the conclusion that it comes to. But the result is almost guaranteed by the process that creates the document. Problem, I think, that exists, and we were asked about this yesterday by several members of the HASC, is how do you? I mean, there has to be some kind of national strategy that gets articulated. I think the QDR, in fact, came about because of the bottom-up review, as you suggested. The Congress thought that was actually a pretty good exercise. Therefore, let's institutionalize it. I think it's time to kind of sunset that exercise, but you have to have some kind of forcing function that creates a strategy. My argument would be, if you think back at some of the great strategic documents that guided the evolution of U.S. strategy after 1945, NSC 68, NSC 162-2, those were not created by a committee of thousands of people working on studies. They were very small groups that were purpose-driven and freed from a lot of the normal bureaucratic constraints. We need to look back, I think, to that kind of model to get at this, rather than what we've adopted with the QDR.
With that, I want to open the floor to questions. Yes, sir. And please do identify yourselves when you're picked. George.
Sir, George Nicholson, a policy consultant for Special Operations and Counterterrorism. You talk about a strategy. Remember, after World War II, President Eisenhower was concerned about a future strategy, and he commissioned what was called the Solarium concept. 3 separate panels in the White House. I think George Kennan orchestrated that. And out of that came the strategy of containment. Do you think there's time now to have another Solarium group?
I've actually looked at the Solarium project, and I actually teach a course on American Grand Strategy at SAIS, where we spend some time on that, and we've actually asked the students to create their own little Solarium. We've got teams going off to figure out a grand strategy and brief it. Look, there's a lot that's attractive about that process, and the process itself, I think, actually stands as one of the great exemplars of how to do this right, as opposed to the way we have done the QDRs. I would have to say I think it's a little harder to imagine that kind of exercise going on today. First of all, the principles of government were involved in that. In other words, President Eisenhower devoted several full-day sessions to all that. In fact, Kennan records in his memoirs that Eisenhower was the towering intellect among all these people who'd been gathered together to do this. But you also had the Secretary of the Treasury, you had Secretary Dulles there participating. You had a lot of high-level government time devoted to that. You had a lot of people across party lines. I mean, George Kennan was actually doing this exercise because he'd actually been PNG'd from the Soviet Union and had not been renewed as an ambassador by Secretary Dulles, and therefore forced into retirement. But somehow or other, he was still able to, play in this process, play a pretty big role. And it's also very hard for me to imagine this going on. None of that leaked. I mean, people didn't know about Solarium until about 40, 50 years after it had happened. in any detail. I mean, people knew kind of the outlines of it, but, no one talked in those days. No one had Bob Woodward, no one was telling Bob Woodward what they thought during the Solarium process when President Eisenhower was recapitulating the three alternative strategies. So, yes, I think it's a potential model, but I worry a little bit about how we would actually execute it in today's kind of environment.
And I would just add that Congress wouldn't go along with it, so that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. Yes, sir, over there in the second row. And then, sir, we'll take you, and then we'll take. Yeah.
Nish Fenn, I'm a member of the George Mason chapter of the Alexander Hamilton Society. There's definitely been a lot of talk of, in the coming century, of what the military will look like, especially with the type of conflicts that we'll be facing. And there's a lot of talk between a smaller, lighter force dependent on the naval power, air power, and special operations, or to continue having a large force to face like large aggressors like China. What is in your opinion, what do you think would be the best solution, especially since in my mind, like, we have so many different commitments internationally, we have bases all over the world, that would like cause us to be spread too thin, and then if there's another powerful country, they could easily take advantage of the fact that we are spread too thin.
Well, I'll take a whack at that, and then Jim may want to chime in. Secretary Gates used to say all the time, and I think he's right, that when we try and predict the future of conflict, we have a perfect record in the United States government. We have always gotten it wrong. And so the problem I think we face a little bit is because we have this unique role, and it's not even really the role of being the sole superpower. Even before we emerged as the sole superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, now it's more complicated because you got rising powers in Asia, but we still were the framework nation after 1945, even in the bipolar era of the Cold War. We provided the framework, at least for the free world, of the rules-based international system of free trade, free passage of the maritime domain. We guaranteed international civil aviation. We set up all these institutions and created this entire apparatus that has led to the largest period of global prosperity in history, as Congressman Marshall was saying. And there's nobody else. I mean, in the late 19th century, beginning of 20th century, Britain had been playing that role. And as it entered its period of decline, as it became the weary Titan, as Aaron Friedberg's book title refers to it, they had someone to pass off that responsibility to, the United States of America. And the problem we have is there's nobody for us to pass this off to. And so we kind of are trapped in that regard. We've got, as you say, these commitments that we have to maintain. One of the things that I think was most challenging to us as a panel was to hear the CNO tell us, and from a previous panel heard a previous CNO tell us, that at the current rate of build for shipbuilding in the U.S. Navy, we are not going to have a large enough Navy to maintain our basic presence mission in the Western Pacific, which is now coming under pretty serious challenge because of the rise of Chinese military power and double-digit defense budget increases every year. I commend to everybody the most recent report of the Congressional China Commission that has an enormous amount of detail about this buildup and why everyone should really be concerned about it. It does explain a little bit, I think, about China's more aggressive posture towards its neighbors over the last 3 or 4 years. We have no choice, I think, but to both maintain the qualitative edge that Secretary Hagel has talked about as being so important. But we also have to recognize that the qualitative edge is not sufficient. It's also quantity. Quantity has a quality all of its own. If you don't have enough ships, you can't be present. You can't maintain your alliances. You can't get your allies to contribute what they need to contribute. So we have to have both, I think.
So we've got sort of a Hobson's choice here, and I was given a talk about the National Defense Panel report and put some slides together. And so I came up with this slide, U.S. global leadership. certainly not a blessing, perhaps a curse, but also a fact. It's kind of where we are right now. And, you know, it's, if we fail to continue to provide the global leadership we have been providing, no question, global instability rises, we get poorer, tax collections are a lot lower, and so, in a sense, we ought to be funding appropriately defense. Now, how do you do it? You know, what do you anticipate? Well, as Gates said, we're pretty bad at predicting exactly what threat will evolve in the future. And in this world right now, pretty clear people don't want to go up against the United States where the United States is strong. Nobody wants to do that. You always pick your enemy's weakest spot. So it's very clear that our military, our security forces generally, need to be agile, and they need to be as current as possible. We need to be ahead of the curve as far as technology is concerned, so that somebody doesn't develop a capability that we can't defeat. We want to have capabilities that they can't defeat, and always have the ability to defeat their capabilities, which requires a great deal of investment in R&D that we're not doing right now because we're worried about readiness, we're worried about carrying personnel, because we're sort of forced to carry personnel not knowing exactly what the budget's going to look like in the future. And that's unfortunate. But are we able to, could the defense panel itself predict what the future is going to look like and how we ought to structure our force? We concluded early on, no. We didn't have the analytic ability, we didn't have the staff, etc. And so a better planning process than the QDR perhaps, not necessarily a solarium that you suggest, you know, we revert to, because I don't think you can get there, but some planning process that guides us in the organization of our force. At the hearing yesterday by the House, we had a few members ask us why we didn't talk about Guard and Reserve. In part, it was because early on we talked about Guard and Reserve and the appropriate mix, and we concluded that we just didn't have, we weren't going to be able to come together as a panel with a recommendation about that subject. So we decided, okay, well, we won't touch that subject. But we could agree on a few things, and in the document, as I said before, we said, we think if you went through another QDR that was not budget informed but was strategy informed, you'd conclude that as far as capacity is concerned, you need more ships, you need more people, you need to, et cetera. So it's capacity and capability and being way ahead of the curve and being very agile.
But isn't there, if you look at China, during the Cold War, raw investment on our part worked because the Soviet Union was isolated from the global economy. China's at the heart of the global economy. Chinese students are at the best American universities. In fact, some of the top engineering and sciences professors will tell you that the best American is sort of number 25 in his program, so they're not his immediate TAs or not the people who are benefiting from that wisdom. They then return to China where they work for Honeywell or GE or Airbus or, you know, a Boeing facility or something else, and then ultimately get good enough where the Chinese technology now is maturing and accelerating in a, you know, so, you know, and we're still spending more on R&D, I think, than anybody else is, including our Pentagon, even though it's reduced it. But do we need to sort of fundamentally rethink this model, because the global flow of technology is a leveler, you know, and Chinese products are no longer seen as sort of the, you know, wow, you know, I play with that train once and the wheels are going to fall off of it, right? I mean, you know, this iPhone in my pocket is made in China, and it's pretty good and doesn't explode into flames. It is collecting on me incessantly, but that's another issue. Did you hear that?
That's why I turned off my iPhone, Vago.
Yes, that's right. They're using mine.
I mean, look, we talk about this actually in the panel report because the QDR itself puts a lot of emphasis on innovation, and that we have to, you know, be more innovative. And now, of course, Secretary Hagel at the Reagan Defense Forum 2 weeks ago announced the so-called third offset strategy.
The Defense Innovation Initiative.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, of course. I mean, this is not the Cold War. This is not the U.S.-Soviet confrontation. This is something much more complex and much more difficult to manage, in part because the speed of technological innovation is so rapid now that the effort to keep pace and keep ahead of the competition is very is a great concern, should be a great concern for everybody. Secretary Hagel, by the way, raised that concern with us early in the panel. I mean, he openly said, I'm not 100% convinced we're investing in all the right things. I hope you guys will look at what do you think we ought to be investing for to have capabilities 20 years out that we need. I think he was very mindful of the fact that we have been consuming the seed corn of the Reagan defense buildup in the 80s, and
It's not a new issue for him.
Yeah.
He's been thinking about that.
so he raised that with us. We tried to address that in the panel, in part because I think we were concerned that there's a danger that innovation becomes a buzzword. We don't have enough money. We can't do everything we need to do. Don't worry, we're going to innovate our way out of this problem.
As if talent and hard work will somehow solve a budget issue.
Right, and
As
so
if talented and hardworking people never existed in the Defense Department before the current crowd.
so we wanted to make sure that didn't become just a kind of
Like transformation.
yeah. We didn't-
Everything is an offset now.
Right.
The toilet is an offset.
Right. So we suggested actually some vectors for future investment, places where we think the department hasn't been placing enough emphasis and money. And I mean, I can go through them pretty quickly, but it includes things like undersea warfare, where we still have a comparative advantage against the Chinese, more unmanned, autonomous undersea capability, smart mines, et cetera. Long-range strike, we said, was something we should look at. More armed, unmanned aviation, directed energy, more effort in space. I mean, there are a whole series of places where we said this is where we ought to be concentrating our future investments to deal with that capability problem. I think we still have a comparative strategic advantage over China for the moment, which is that China really does have a problem with innovation. They can do a great job of buying Russian military technology, reverse engineering it, and then producing it on their own. They have even shown some ability to do things that we didn't think they could do, or at least didn't think they could do as fast as they've done them. But they still have some barriers, and we still are a country that remains open, to innovation. I mean, it's a little bit beyond the scope of either the report or this panel, but I think one of the things we ought to be thinking about in terms of national grand strategy is thinking about issues like energy and immigration as part of our national grand strategy. I mean, our immigration policy, when considered not in the domestic political context that we normally consider it in, ought to be seen as part of our comparative strategic advantage. But our current, immigration policies are crazy from that point of view. I mean, so if we've got a kid from Bangalore who comes to the United States, goes to MIT, develops some really, neat gee whiz bang, process in metallurgy that we could apply in defense industry, we say, thank you very much for spending time in our country. Please go back, and there's not a really good path for you to become a citizen. But if you have no skills, and want to come here and do gardening or childcare for us,
Be a reporter.
y'all come. So we've got to change that, and we've got to think about it as a strategic natural advantage in the United States.
Yeah, one opportunity for the United States globally is to sort of be Aspen in a sense, and there's no real reason why we can't do that, but we have to change our immigration policies and be more open to the possibilities that you just described. We spent a lot of time talking about Russia, China, other places, and concluded that it was a mistake for us to lionize or demonize any of those places, any of those countries. And that certainly applies to China. There is a terrific opportunity for us to work in partnership with China that would advantage China tremendously and the United States as well. And so we do need to be prepared in the event that there is conflict, but if history is, if it demonstrates anything, it's that countries that start lionizing and demonizing one another and then building up militarily, worried that there might be conflict, and then it's like Ferguson and the press coverage of Ferguson. Well, there might be a problem when the grand jury report comes out. Oh, I think there's probably going to be a problem. Oh, no, I think there's certainly going to be a problem. It was self-fulfilling prophecy, and so you worry that by demonizing, lionizing, and then preparing for conflict, on both sides you eventually get to the point where somebody pulls the button and there is a conflict, and that's a big problem for both sides. China is in a real difficult part of the world. It's got huge problems that face it structurally across a broad number of issues. It's going to have great needs, and it's going to fare much better in a good partnership with the United States than if it is at odds with the United States.
And it's benefited from Pax Americana from the very beginning. Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely.
My name is Sharice. Hi, I'm Sharice. I'm from the George Mason chapter of the Alexander Hamilton Society as
You guys
well.
are all sitting together? So,
It's just us two.
there are two of you.
Yes.
Okay. Just seeing whether or not
It's
we
the
just got to
society.
keep moving the mic down the road.
There's three.
Now there's 3. Do I see 4?
There's a whole handful of people from the Hamilton Society here, I think, actually. I had a question about back on the defense spending issues with European and NATO dependence on the United States. What's your opinion on whether or not Europe should become more military independent, or whether or not we should continue providing 3/4 of their military capabilities?
I at one point, talking to a bunch of European commissioners, suggested that and this is early on in the Iraq conflict, and I suggested that the United States had the military capabilities to do this sort of thing in spades, at least the conventional part of it. Your guys can get shot on street corners just like our guys can, so the non-conventional part of it, we need as much help as we can get. But on the conventional side, maybe don't worry about developing those capabilities. In a sense, unless we're coordinated very well, if we go and do joint operations, it's very difficult for us to do it. We're worried that the coordination is difficult because we don't have the same capabilities, communication protocols, etc. And so I suggested, we'll do the hard stuff, and why don't you think about the soft stuff, coming in and rebuilding and etc. And one of these guys says to me, he says, oh, so you're going to be perpetually the bad guys and we're going to be the good guys. I went, well, that's a good point. Maybe that wasn't such a good suggestion by me. We've had a partnership for a long time. We always want them to contribute more than they have. They're cutting back left and right. And one big mistake by us would be to think that somehow they're going to reverse course and somehow they're going to step forward and fill some of the gaps that we're creating because we're not funding our military appropriately. It'd be nice if that happened, but it should be supplementing what we do. And we should not expect that it's going to happen because, if anything, the trends there are in the opposite direction.
So this, I think, falls unfortunately into the general category of be careful, what you wish for because you might get it. After the end of World War II, when we created NATO, famously in Lord Ismay's formulation, we did it to keep the Russians out, the U.S. in and the Germans down. And,
It worked.
And it worked. And so we created essentially what was a defense protectorate. It was an alliance, and it was not, like the Warsaw Pact, but it basically was a protectorate where we provided the overwhelming security presence and guarantee for Europe, and it allowed Europe to rebuild. After a devastating war, it allowed Europe to become prosperous, and it allowed Europe to become relatively irresponsible, with a few exceptions, when it comes to security. And all those trends since the end of the Cold War have gotten worse. Essentially, in the Cold War, we used to have the 3% solution. We wanted all the allies to spend 3% of GDP on defense, while we were spending 6 and 7. Now after the Cold War, we wanted them to spend 2%. Now we got a lot of NATO members, including founding members of the alliance, who are sliding below 1% of GDP. And I said, for a lot of demographic reasons and others, as cultural reasons, as Congressman Marshall has suggested, I don't think it's likely that these trends are going to reverse anytime soon. I don't think that means that we withdraw from NATO or we say the hell with NATO or any of that. I think what it means is we have to think about how we operate in NATO differently. I think the good news is that there are a couple of countries that remain serious about defense and who are investing in defense. Poland, for instance, among the new NATO members, comes to mind. I never thought I would ever say this on a public stage, but the French have been an incredible, valuable ally over the last
That didn't hurt that much,
6 or
did it?
7 years. No, the French are very serious about defense, and we should welcome that. I worry, frankly, about our colleagues in the United Kingdom, and I don't know what will happen after the next election there. But I think that the special relationship between the United States and the UK is at best on life support and may already be clinically dead. We just don't know it yet. That to me remains to be determined. That would be, in my view, a development to be mourned, not celebrated. But I think we have to also maybe face facts about it. Secretary Gates used to say during when I was his undersecretary, when we were working on Afghanistan, that we had to try and figure out whether NATO was going to be a two-tier alliance in which some NATO members fought and others didn't. Unfortunately, I think we've run that experiment and we know what the answer is now. So now we just have to live with the reality and work our way through it.
The only thing worse than not fighting with your allies, is
fighting without.
fighting without them. And yes, sir.
Always happy to quote Churchill.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, my name is Alireza Jafarzadeh with the National Council of Resistance of Iran. I guess we can't talk about defense without talking about stopping Iran's nuclear weapons program. And I know there has been a lot of talk about the number of centrifuges, how many centrifuges they should be allowed. I know the administration has been boasting that they have degraded some of the 20% enriched uranium and a number of other steps. But I want you to talk about the things that hasn't been really addressed, and both the weaponization and the verification. The long-lasting, outstanding questions like the possible military dimensions, dating back to 2003, they're still hanging there for 11 years, 10 years. How is that going to be resolved in 7 months or even afterwards if they didn't comply before with all the sanctions and everything? Second, in terms of verification, access to military sites, to experts, to documents, if that has not been accomplished in the past 11, 12 years, how is that going to be accomplished? You take the example of the military site in Parchin, where the opposition just recently said that they have 2 high explosive chambers built for that. None of that has been accessed by the IAEA. The IAEA is complaining as we speak about that they can't answer those questions. So what happens to those sites and access to experts like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and Saeed Borja and others, and the sites in Parchin, Sapand, Mojde, Labizanshan, and others? So I would really be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
If I could go first.
Please.
And simply say that you obviously have expertise far beyond mine on this particular question. And I hope that the talks that are going on will be productive. And my general hope is that Iran winds up being an ally, not an enemy of the United States. It's a natural partner for the United States. How we get there, it's the National Defense Panel members asked a question. If we were asked a question like that, would simply defer and say we were much more high level in what we were looking at, and we didn't get into the granularity of the kind of questions that you have about the Iranian negotiations that are going on right now.
Well, I'll just say this. I mean, as Congressman Marshall said, this was well beyond the scope of our panel's report. I would say that you have raised, and you didn't mention one other issue that needs addressing, which is the state of Iran's ballistic missile program, which would obviously be the main mechanism of delivery, though not the only mechanism of delivery. To me, it is incomprehensible how any successful agreement could be reached without dealing with PMD, past military dimensions, and the ballistic missile program. In the first instance, you asked about verification without getting into the details or the weeds on this. In my view, as someone who formerly had to worry about this as the statutorily designated chief advisor or civilian advisor on war plans to the Secretary of Defense, is how do you have a verification regime for such an agreement if you haven't understood exactly what they were doing on the military side in the past. How would you even know where to look if you haven't got resolution on all of those questions? I mean, your question about Parchin, I think, answers itself. The IAEA reports, most recent report, suggests that Parchin has almost been totally cleansed at this point. So we're now pretty much at the point where even if the IAEA was given total access to Parchin, there'd be nothing left to find. And so I think this is an area where the Congress needs to be very vigilant and active. And I have no doubt that Senators Kirk and Menendez and many others who have devoted a lot of time and attention to this issue, Congressman Engel, Congressman Deutsch, I have no doubt that they will try, and Senator Corker, as if he becomes chairman, as I think he will, of the Foreign Relations Committee, I think all of them are committed to Congress having some ability to review what is agreed. And I think they have an enormous role to play here, both with regard to the review and sanctions.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it, Chris. Thanks very much for having us. Ambassador Edelman, thank you very much for joining us. Congressman Martin. And thanks also to Rachel and Caitlin and everybody for making this happen. Thank you.